Hello guys, and welcome to another video. Now this one I want to do a bit of discussion on a unique weapon that I think is going to be really strong in the upcoming patch, and that is Saitha's Spear. And that's because of quite a few changes coming in this patch that will affect this weapon directly, and I think there's going to be kind of new builds sprouting up from this one. So what exactly does Saitha's Spear do? Well, it has one very important modifier that makes it unique from anything else, which is this one right here. Aggravating any bleeding with this weapon also aggravates all ignites on the target. So, the way how Aggravate works is that it's kind of this special mechanic that is usually based on bleeding, and bleeding has this built-in mechanic where targets take additional damage from bleeding if they're actually moving. In this patch that's actually being removed from bleeding that's inflicted on the player character, but it will still work for bleeding that is inflicted on monsters by yourself. So, the way how bleeding works is you're basically going to be dealing 15% of the pre-mitigation physical damage of a hit per second for 5 seconds total. That's the baseline damage. And then if the target's moving, they'll be taking double that damage, so 30% a second for 5 seconds. But to force that extra damage, you can instead aggravate the bleed. So by aggravating a bleed, it will deal that extra damage even if the target remains stationary. And you won't actually get that damage twice if a target is both aggravated and moving. But this just means that the bleeding is going to deal a lot more damage once it's aggravated. And Saitha's Spear has a way to aggravate not only the bleeding, because it has a chance for that, and this is actually a very big chance on this weapon. This modifier is usually pretty hard to come by. It's usually very small amounts, like 10% or 15% chance, for example. This can roll up to 40% on the weapon. But the weapon will also allow you to aggravate ignites on the target as well, which is a mechanic that is completely exclusive to this weapon as far as I know, because ignites usually can't be aggravated. It's usually a mechanic that's just tied to bleeding. So by aggravating at ignite, it will essentially pass on that double damage modifier to ignite. So the way how ignite normally works baseline is that it's dealing 20% of the pre-mitigation fire damage in a hit per second for 4 seconds total, and if it's aggravated, it will be dealing 40% per second for 4 seconds at a baseline. So that's going to make it much, much stronger as a method of dealing actual damage rather than kind of a secondary damage option that is more of an afterthought. Now, why do I think Saitha's Spear is going to be really good in this patch in particular? First of all, it's important to understand this weapon was already very good in the last patch, and it was kind of overshadowed by a bunch of other stuff going on in the patch, but it was good because they added a Vaal Cultivation modifier here, and the way this currency works, you use this orb on the weapon when it's already corrupted, and then you can actually replace one of its modifiers with a Vaal Cultivation modifier. And you may actually end up with more than one Vaal Cultivation modifier, which wouldn't be ideal, because the only modifier you're looking for in this bunch here is the 300 to 400% increased physical damage, which is an absolutely absurd amount of physical damage as a local physical damage modifier. And of course, this can replace any of these modifiers with the modifier that you actually want there. And there are some modifiers that you don't want to remove, namely this one, because we just discussed how important that is if you're actually using this weapon. If you remove that, it's basically useless at that point. But you also don't want to remove the flat physical damage, because this interacts with the increased physical damage. Of course, they're both local physical damage modifiers. That's going to give you a massive amount of base damage on the spear. So ideally, I think the modifier you would probably want to remove is either the flat fire damage or the chance to cause bleeding on hit, because both of those are quite replaceable elsewhere. You know, you can get a lot of chance to cause bleeding elsewhere on the tree and on gear and things like that, and flat damage you can also find elsewhere as well. But what you want is that increased physical damage modifier on this weapon, along with the Aggravate modifier and the physical damage. Then you're going to have a spear that's actually quite good, and that's already a thing in the current patch. But in this patch, we're getting a lot more. So first of all, we have this change right here, which is the new Runeforging bench. And this says that after unlocking the unique Verisium Runeforging in Act 3, you can upgrade the base type of unique weapons and armors that have drop levels lower than 55. Upgrading unique weapons will have higher damage. So this is a weapon that is already quite a low level weapon, and you're going to be able to add more damage to this weapon, and that is going to interact incredibly well with this increased physical damage modifier. This is going to be a really good weapon when you hit the right Vaal Cultivation orb on this item. One extra thing to mention there about these Vaal Cultivation modifiers is that in the patch notes, they actually specifically mention some changes here to Vaal Cultivation orbs, some, changed modifiers and some removed modifiers and things like that, and Saitha Spear does not appear here. It actually doesn't appear at all in the patch notes. So I think it's safe to assume that at least right now, this spear and this modifier right here is untouched for 0.5. Now, the weapon and the Vaal Cultivation modifier and the Runeforging is not all, because there's something else in the upcoming patch, the Blistering Bond unique ring. Now, this is actually kind of a cool unique ring in the current patch. It doesn't really get used very much, but it has kind of a cool modifier here, which makes you take fire damage instead of physical damage from bleeding. This modifier is kind of being pseudo-nerfed in the upcoming patch, because bleeding is going to be generally less threatening for players, since they no longer take extra damage from moving while they have that debuff on them. But this ring is getting buffed to kind of compensate for that change. So there's a patch note right here. The Blistering Bond unique ring now has fire damage also contributes to bleeding magnitude, and bleeding you inflict deals fire damage instead of physical damage in addition to its other modifiers. So you'll now be able to inflict bleeding using fire damage, and your bleeding will deal fire damage. Now that is extremely good with this spear, because you can make use of an attack like Explosive Spear, which was buffed last patch. This is actually a very strong skill right now, because the Frenzy Charge version deals 724% of weapon damage at level 20, and it has some, increased ignite magnitude and things like that. But most importantly, this converts all of your physical damage to fire, so you deal a huge hit of fire damage that then can inflict both ignite and bleed, and both of those debuffs deal fire damage. So you can scale your damage purely based off of fire damage. That means not only modifiers to, fire damage for increased damage and things like that, and support gems, but also in terms of how the enemy actually takes damage. So if we head over here to the passive skill tree, we can have a look at some of these fire damage modifiers. For example, we've got Melting Flames here, which says, enemies ignited by you permanently take 1% increased fire damage for every second that they have ever been ignited by you, up to a maximum of 10%. Well, the enemy takes fire damage from both bleeding and ignite, so this will scale your damage for both debuffs. There's also this modifier over here, which is Fire Starter, and this says enemies ignited by you have minus 5% to fire resistance. Again, that will help you scale both your bleeding and ignite damage at the same time. Now, the last thing I want to mention in regards to this weapon is, of course, that the critical hit chance isn't great. It's a base 6% crit spear, and usually when it comes to kind of ailment-based builds, you're going to want to go into crit, especially in the late game, because that is a huge damage scaling potential vector there for ailment builds. So I will mention a few things that you can kind of play around with in terms of crit chance. For example, there's the Struck Through node there on the passive tree that appears on the right side. This could be anointed. It adds +1 to critical strike chance. That'd be nice to bring that up from 6 to 7. And you can also play around with actually inflicting critical weakness. There's actually quite a few ways to inflict critical weakness in the game now, so that you can, benefit from that bonus added flat critical strike chance. And on top of that, in the very late game, when you end up spending a lot of currency and things like that into the build, there's the Garrocan's Resolve, which will cap your maximum crit chance at 50%, but it will make your critical strike chance bifurcate, which basically means that the critical strike chance is rolled twice, and if either of them succeed, it's a critical hit, but if both of them succeed, it will apply your critical damage bonus twice, which is extremely strong, as I mentioned before there, for, ailment damage scaling. Generally speaking, the hit is also going to be very big, of course, because that's how ailments work in PoE2. But that is definitely something you could look towards doing in the endgame, and I don't think this being a 6% crit chance base spear is really the end of it in terms of, it being able to crit or not. You can definitely go down avenues to actually scale that up. But that is going to be it for this video. I wanted to just put this one together because I noticed a few things in the patch note that kind of lined up really well for this spear. This one was already something that I was looking at quite a bit in the last patch. I did want to get around to making an explosive spear build last patch, but it just didn't happen. So maybe this patch, this will be something that I look at for a second build. I definitely wouldn't recommend it as a starter, because you kind of want this modifier right here, and, this is going to be something where, in the upcoming patch, the Vaal Temple isn't going to be, it's not the league mechanic anymore, so people actually have to interact with that in the end game to be able to get the Vaal Cultivation Orb currency items, so they're going to be a bit rarer, I think, harder to come by, and that means that getting the right modifier and, not removing a modifier that you really need and things like that, it's all going to be taking a bit more time, and you're going to be spending more currency on actually doing those things. So this is definitely not a starter thing. It's going to be something you want to look towards for maybe a second or third build if you want to go that far in this league. But definitely an interesting weapon to look out for in the upcoming patch. It has a lot of synergy there. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.